Chapter 8 Humankind at the End of Days. I don't think it's productive to have any discussion about the end of our time on Earth that doesn't explain the full context of what will happen to us before, during, and after. Without that, the subject of the end of days is nothing but sensationalism, a series of threatening, fear-inducing headlines that offer no hope and no reminder that we were living busy, productive, joyful lives before we came here, and we'll go right on with those same lives when our days on this planet are over. It's simply a fact that as this century progresses, humankind will become more and more spiritually oriented. I'm seeing it already, every single day, in readings, lectures, and television appearances. Clients whose questions even 5 years ago were primarily focused on Mr. or Ms. Right, finances, career concerns, and health problems are now almost exclusively wanting to know about their spiritual goals, specifically, whether or not they're on track in fulfilling those goals and whether or not they're accomplishing the life purposes they set up for themselves. This increasing global growth in spirituality as a priority is no accident and no coincidence. God didn't create a whimsical, haphazard universe in which it's a roll of the dice what might happen next. There's an eternal order, a divine plan that guides our spirits like an inescapable safety net, even when we're too self-involved to believe that it's there and that it will never, ever let us fall. God's plan for us has existed since time began, and it will go right on existing into infinity. And it's because of that plan that we can count on Earth becoming a far more God-centered place as the countdown to the end of days begins ticking away more loudly. Preparing to come here later in this chapter, I'll describe the specifics of our arrival back home and the perfect eternity of our lives there. For now, I want to remind you, and I do mean remind you, since your spirit remembers it perfectly, of the process we undertake when we decide to take a temporary break from the other side and come here to challenge our souls toward their highest possible advancement. Life on the other side, as you'll read in a while, is idyllic. It's paradise. We're surrounded by endless, exquisite beauty. We live among the angels and the messiahs, loved and loving, perpetually busy and stimulated, in a sanctified atmosphere that's alive with the immediate, tangible presence of God. It seems almost insane that from time to time we choose to leave home for yet another incarnation on this harsh, imperfect planet. But as my spirit guide Francine always says when I complain to her about some particularly tough challenges I'm going through, what have you learned when times were good? Perfection, wonderful as it is, doesn't inspire growth. And God created each of us with our own unique potential and a divine insistence on reaching that potential, no matter what it takes. On the other side, we can study all we want about every subject that exists, including fear, negativity, temptation, violence, and cruelty. But studying those subjects without experiencing them is like reading every book to be found on driving a car without ever getting behind the wheel. Since fear, negativity, temptation, violence, and cruelty don't exist at home, we have to come here to confront it, grow from it, and ultimately overcome it, not only for the benefit of humankind but also for the progress toward the highest potential of our souls. We never arrive on Earth without mapping out specific goals and challenges for ourselves, just as we'd never decide to attend college and then pull out of the driveway without having a clue what school we're headed for, what courses we want to take, or where we'll be living while we're there. Our plans for each new incarnation are meticulously detailed, to guarantee the success of our trip away from home. We choose our parents. We choose our siblings. We choose our birthplace and the exact time and date of our birth, which means we select every detail of our astrological chart. We choose every aspect of our physical appearance and every physical and mental challenge we'll be facing. We choose our friends, our lovers, our spouses, our children, our bosses, our co-workers, our casual acquaintances, and our pets. We choose all the dark entities we'll meet along the way. More about dark entities later in this chapter. We choose every city, neighborhood, and house we'll live in. We choose our preferences, our weaknesses, our flaws, our skills, and our areas of incompetence. It's a reliable assumption that the more difficult the circumstances a spirit charts for its new incarnation, the more advanced that spirit is in its journey toward perfection. One of the many things that makes my hair stand on end is when I hear some judgmental fool state as if it's true that someone who's mentally or physically challenged is obviously being punished for some sin they committed in a past life. Just exactly the opposite is true. The superior courage and wisdom it takes to chart a life involving any form of severe disadvantage is worthy of our greatest admiration and nothing less. It's the definition of an advanced soul. As this century progresses, more and more of these advanced souls will be incarnating. That's not a guess or an assumption, it's simple logic. We write our charts with full knowledge of the earthly backdrop against which we'll be living the life we're mapping out. Civil wars, world wars, the Great Depression, the Holocaust, the World Trade Center tragedy, every one of those events, every event no matter how historic or seemingly trivial, was and is anticipated on the other side by those who choose to be here and involved at the time. Again, the more difficult the life a soul charts for itself, the more advanced the soul that composed the chart. Advanced souls have willingly participated in earthly cataclysms since the beginning of life on earth, and advanced souls will willingly participate at the end. By definition, then, as we approach the year 2100, we're going to see more and more advanced souls volunteering to incarnate and be here for the end of days, if they choose, which we'll discuss momentarily. And as the population of advanced souls on this planet increases, the spirituality on earth will become increasingly powerful, almost palpable, a global, inspiring, purifying wave of the divine. In addition to the growing number of advanced spirits among us, my spirit guide Francine tells me that the veil between the dimension of the other side and the dimension of earth is slowly but surely fading away. To understand that, you have to know that the other side is only 3 feet above our ground level. It simply exists on a frequency so much higher than ours on Earth that it's difficult for us to perceive its presence. As this century progresses, the difference between these two frequencies will diminish, with the result that humankind will become increasingly aware of the spirit world of home, i.e., increasingly at peace with the approaching end of days thanks to more and more reminders of where we came from and where we're joyfully headed. It's worth noting that, just as I'm meeting more and more people whose spirituality is a top priority, I'm also meeting more and more people who are on their last incarnations on Earth. Remember, we choose when and how often to take these brief field trips away from the other side, and it's not uncommon for a spirit to choose to come here dozens of times. I'm on my 52nd incarnation, for example, and my last, I'm delighted to add. I'm convinced that some of us are on our last incarnations because we've learned all we feel we need to from the earthly experience, while others of us are simply aware that by the time we'd be considering another field trip, Earth won't be able to sustain human life any longer. And I can't stress enough, we'll be perfectly content with the sacred bliss of eternity, not on this temporary plane we're just visiting but on the divine dimension of our real home. Exit points. I mentioned earlier that the increasingly advanced spirits who choose to incarnate in this century can also choose whether or not they want that incarnation to end with the end of humankind's days on Earth. That's because in the charts we write before we come here we include something called exit points. Exit points are simply circumstances we prearrange that can result in the end of the incarnation we're about to undertake, if we choose to take advantage of them at the moment they occur. We write 5 exit points into our charts, but we don't necessarily wait until the 5th one to head home. We might decide on our first one, or our second, third, or fourth, that we've accomplished all we intended on this trip. Nor do we space them out in regular intervals when we plan them. We might arrange for 2 or 3 exit points in the same year, for example, and our next one another 20 or 30 years later. Obvious exit points include critical illnesses, accidents, near misses, and any other events that could logically be expected to result in death but are somehow survived against all odds. Other exit points are so subtle that we might not even notice them until and unless we look back on them later. A decision for no reason to drive a different route from usual to a frequent destination, trivial delays that cause us to miss a plane or be on the road at the time we'd intended, staying home from a social event or an appointment because we suddenly just don't feel like it. Any number of incidents that seem meaningless at the time could easily be our spirit's memory of an exit point that we've decided against taking. The fact of exit points brings up another fascinating point about the end of days. Every human being who's alive when the end of days arrives will be here by their own charted design, and will have written the end of life on Earth as their 5th exit point. Their conscious minds might not be aware of that choice, but their spirit minds will know that their chart is now complete and their purpose for their final trip to this planet has been accomplished. Extraterrestrials. One of the most dramatic headlines in 2012 will be the discovery of some mysterious debris in a California/Nevada desert. It will be impossible to tell what the original shape of the large, mangled object was, but the alloy it was made of clearly wasn't manufactured from earthly materials. A group of civilians will come across it and, for a refreshing change of pace, will thoroughly document the event and notify the authorities rather than the tabloids. As a result, the government won't have the opportunity to spin the debris into non-existence, nor can those who discovered it be accused of trying to perpetrate a fraud by selling their story. This discovery will occur in conjunction with a series of untraceable signals that will disrupt satellite transmissions and wireless communications throughout the world. And by the end of 2012 or the beginning of 2013, having finally put 2 and 2 together, organized groups of explorers, researchers, government agencies, and other experts will undertake formal worldwide expeditions in search of extraterrestrials. Of course, extraterrestrials have been here for millions of years and they're here now, calling as little attention to themselves as possible as they contribute to our society through careers that their advanced knowledge make possible. They're among our most brilliant researchers, space engineers, nuclear physicists, teachers, scientists, judges, social reformers. Any pursuit that will leave its mark as indelibly as their collaboration with us on the Great Pyramid and Stonehenge all those centuries ago. 2 of them are currently valued employees of NASA, and one of them was a Nobel Prize winner. It's preposterous to be afraid of extraterrestrials, as science fiction books and movies have encouraged us to be. Let's face it, they're so far beyond us technologically that they can easily and routinely travel here from Andromeda, the Pleiades, and other galaxies we aren't even aware of yet. But we think they don't have the technology to destroy us in the blink of an eye if that were their purpose for being here. In about 2018, extraterrestrials will be making our search for them much easier. They'll begin outing themselves, safely and sanely and very much in public, to such organizations as the United Nations, Scotland Yard, NASA, and even a Camp David summit. They'll step forward by the thousands and willingly subject themselves to a whole battery of psychological and biological tests, confirming that the origins of their various species are not earthly. By the early 2020s, we humans will reach an accord with the extraterrestrials in our midst and those still to come. Many of the dramatic advancements in our own space travel will be the direct result of what we've learned from them, from the manned Mars exploration in 2012 and the chartered moon junkets in the late 2030s to the lunar base of the early 2040s that will become a wildly popular tourist destination. Let's face it, we're not just a part of a global community, we're also a part of a universal community. Why that seems to frighten some people I have no idea. Because we earthly residents are the universal version of the new kids on the block, we have an infinite wealth of development and spiritual growth to look forward to from our brothers and sisters on other planets when we finally embrace them and start listening. Of even more importance, residents of other planets are God's creation, His children, just as we are, after all. They have the same journeys of the soul that we do, the same options of reincarnation, and the same sacred bliss to look forward to on the other side, not our other side, but their own. Every inhabited planet throughout the universe has a divine home of its own, and just think how grateful we might be for that fact when we can no longer live on the earthly home we're in the process of destroying. I know that some of you who are reading this are feeling a deep, odd twinge of familiarity in your soul, very possibly without having a clue what's causing it. It's not because you're actually aliens from somewhere else in the universe. Aliens know exactly who they are and where they came from. Instead, it's because, probably without a conscious awareness of it, you're a highly advanced spirit called a mystical traveler, and mystical travelers have a whole different perspective on the earthly end of days. Mystical travelers in all this talk about advanced spirits, I don't want to give the mistaken impression that advanced means more important. In God's eyes, every one of us is of equal importance and value. We are all His children, and He created each of us to be utterly unique, each with our own purpose, dependent on our highest possible level of advancement. For a simple earthly example of the equal importance of various levels of advancement, think of the military. Generals are absolutely highly advanced and essential, but without the armies of soldiers they command, what do you think their odds would be of winning a battle? I promise you, every purpose God bestows is indispensable to His great plan for this infinite, flawless universe, and every spirit is equally cherished. So when I talk about a level of highly advanced souls called mystical travelers, I'm not implying that these are souls who've been specially endowed by God or are held in higher esteem than the rest of us. Mystical travelers are spirits who, in the course of their soul's journey, have essentially said to God, "Wherever in this universe you need me, I'll willingly go." Their universal mission is to help maintain the divine spiritual connection between God and His children as a thriving, viable, ever-present force. Toward that purpose, they've volunteered to incarnate on any inhabited planet in any galaxy where God needs them. Most mystical travelers have experienced many lifetimes on Earth as well as on other planets, and whether or not they become public figures, they quietly touch the lives around them in ways that are almost transcendent in their impact. They seem divinely lit from within, and the rest of us are drawn to them, quite literally like moths to flames. They're uncommonly peaceful, uncommonly empathetic, uncommonly spiritual, and uncommonly graceful in the often difficult work they're here to do on God's behalf. Mother Teresa was a mystical traveler. Joan of Arc was a mystical traveler. 13-year-old poet, philosopher, and theologian Mattie Stepanek was a mystical traveler. There are more among us who may never become famous but who will leave no doubt about their spiritual brilliance for those who will never be the same because of them. And even more of them will gather on earth as this century progresses, to lend their incomparable hearts, courage, and spirits to God's greatest service while the end of days draws closer. Then, rather than the eternity of divine perfection on the other side that most of us have to look forward to when life on earth becomes impossible, mystical travelers will stop at home just long enough to chart their next incarnation on any other planet in any other galaxy where God needs them most. The dark side at the end of days. The dark side is that segment of the population who've rejected God and His laws of humanity, integrity, compassion, and non-judgmental love. We'll call them dark entities for this discussion, since they're polar opposites. Those who embrace and revere God and the white light of the Holy Spirit are called white entities. And don't let it enter your mind that dark and white are references to race or skin color. The mere suggestion of any such thing is offensive. God didn't create the evil negativity that rules the dark side. What He did create are spirits endowed with free will. And some spirits used that free will to turn their backs on their Creator and pursue lives unencumbered by adoration of anyone but themselves. Dark entities are their own gods, too narcissistic to believe in any being superior to them. They might profess a deep, profound belief in God, and they might even be able to recite the entire Bible by heart if they think it will help gain the trust, allegiance, and adoration of someone they're eager to manipulate and control. They might also be very fond of working Satan and other mythical devils into their monologues. Dark entities only occasionally tolerate actual give-and-take conversation, but only when they're facing consequences they don't like and they need someone else to blame. The dark side exists in both human and spirit form, just as we white entities do. In human form, they look exactly like the rest of us. Don't forget, if it weren't for the choices they've made, they'd be the rest of us. They might be a family member, a lover or spouse, a neighbor, co-worker, a boss, a supposed friend. In spirit form, their negative energy can deeply affect everything from mechanical and electrical devices to our mental health without our even realizing what's happening. But whether they're in human form or spirit form, dark entities all share the same basic qualities. They have no conscience, no sincere remorse, and no sense of responsibility for their actions. They take all the credit and none of the blame for everything that happens around them, and self-justification is their first and only response to criticism. In psychiatric terms, they're true sociopaths. They expertly mimic human behavior without ever really feeling it. They can simulate charm, sensitivity, empathy, love, regret, and piety to gain proximity to us. They promptly drop the act once they've won us over, though, having no further use for it and frankly finding it to be too much work. We white entities, because our emotions and faith are genuine, have trouble imagining that we've been witnessing a performance. So we cling to our trust in them and our loyalty to them, trying desperately to re-inspire that wonderful person we're sure is in there because we saw them with our own eyes, unable to grasp that that wonderful person never really existed in the first place. As far as the dark side is concerned, we white entities are nothing but a collection of walking mirrors. If their reflection through our eyes is flattering, we're valuable to them. But the minute we catch on that we've been looking at a mask, and they no longer like the way they look in our mirror, they'll react in one of two ways. They'll get as far away from us as possible, or they'll repeat the award-winning performance that attracted us in the first place in the hope of attracting us again. Dark entities couldn't care less about the laws of God or the laws of respectable society. They live by their own selfing rules, which change at their convenience and don't necessarily apply to anyone else around them. They view even their worst behavior as perfectly, invariably acceptable, but they might become outraged if someone else aims that same behavior at them. The result of this seeming inconsistency is that the white entities close to them are kept constantly off balance, which gives the dark entity that much more power. The goal of the dark entity isn't to turn a white entity dark. They know that can't be done. Their goal is to extinguish the white entity's light, since darkness can't exist where light is present. They don't necessarily try to destroy the white entity physically. More often they'll simply create as much emotional turbulence, self-doubt, guilt, and depression as possible in as many white entities they have access to, so that the white entities lose their self-confidence, strength, and power. Dark entities rarely enjoy each other's company with no light to extinguish, no flattering reflection to gaze into, and no control to be gained over someone with the same bag of tricks. There would be no point. Instead, they methodically and deliberately seek us out. And at least once in our lives, we're likely to seek them out too. It has nothing to do with being stupid. It has to do with taking our spiritual responsibilities seriously and believing it's our moral responsibility to reach out to someone we perceive to be lost, in trouble, or misunderstood. Of course, it's against our humanitarian instincts to turn our back on a child of God who needs us. But when it's the dark side we're up against, we're wasting our time. A dark entity can't be turned white, any more than a white entity can be turned dark. We can't appeal to a conscience that doesn't exist, we can't inspire genuine remorse in someone who takes no responsibility for their actions, and we can't ignite sincere love in someone who only loves God Himself on an as-needed basis. I say this as both a spiritual psychic and as a person who's learned the hard way: if there's a dark entity in your life, in Jesus' own words, shake off the dust from your feet and leave. Matthew 10:14. No discussion of who dark entities are would be complete without making it clear who they aren't. Not all murderers and other violent criminals are dark entities. Not everyone who's ever hurt you is a dark entity. Not everyone who's ill-tempered or hard to get along with is a dark entity. Not everyone you don't like, or who doesn't like you, is a dark entity. There are white entities I don't like. There are white entities who don't like me. This isn't about labeling people, or passing judgment, or worst of all, becoming a spiritual snob, which can be just as repelling as the dark side itself. It's simply about learning how and why we need to pay close attention to who's in our lives. True, we wrote every one of those people into our charts before we came here. But we wrote in some of them to teach us the wisdom of knowing when to walk away, the one area in which the dark side can be of use to us for a change. They sound like the perfect candidates to be sent straight to hell, especially at the end of days, don't they? You're about to read, though, why I'll never believe that hell is where any of us ends up. The left door. I promise you from the core of my soul that the closest thing to an actual place called hell is this earth we're living on, this tough boot camp we voluntarily come to from time to time for progress along the eternal journey of our souls. There is no bottomless pit. There is no fiery abyss of flames and agony. There is no eternal banishment to a place more horrible than we can ever imagine. That being true, and it's fair to wonder what happens to the dark side when their lifetime ends. The answer isn't pretty, but again, they have no one to thank but themselves. When a dark entity dies, their spirit never experiences the tunnel and the sacred light at its end. Instead, they're propelled straight through the other side's left door, or, as my granddaughter used to call it when she was a little girl, mean heaven. Please don't let me create the mistaken impression that when we reach the other side we see two doors and have to choose between the left and the right. Only a handful of times have I heard of a near-death survivor being conscious of finding two doors at the end of the tunnel, and there was no danger of their stepping through the wrong one. The dark side has already chosen the left door through an unrepentant lifetime of physically, emotionally, and/or spiritually abusing God's children, so no other door is even visible to them when they die. And inside the left door is an infinite abyss of godless, joyless, all-consuming nothingness. The only permanent residents of this abyss are faceless beings in hooded cloaks, who've become the artistic and literary archetype for the persona of death, aka the Grim Reaper. These beings don't act as dark spirit guides or avenging angels. They function more as a council, overseeing the paths of the spirits who make a brief appearance in their presence. And the spirit's time in the void behind the left door is nothing if not brief. Unlike spirits on the other side who can choose when and whether to return to Earth for another incarnation, dark entities travel straight from their bodies at death, through the left door into the godless darkness they've chosen, and right back in utero again, on a self-inflicted horseshoe-shaped journey that leaves them as dark at birth as they were at death in their previous life. Let's take Ted Bundy as a prototype of the dark side, since his series of murders are indisputable and by all accounts he didn't experience a moment of even insincere remorse before he was executed. The instant Ted Bundy died, his spirit traveled through the left door and entered the womb of some poor unsuspecting woman who is probably wondering where she went wrong as a parent, when the truth is the dark course of her child's life was already determined before it was born. I've said a million times in lectures, and I'll say it again now, do not get pregnant immediately after hearing the news that Charles Manson has died, unless you want to be the horribly unlucky recipient of that dark spirit when it horseshoes back to Earth again. I can't tell you how relieved I was, and how many of my long-standing questions were answered, when I learned the truth about the dark side's journey through the left door and back into the womb. As a psychic, I can look at most people and see a whole crowd of spirits from the other side, from spirit guides to departed loved ones to angels. But from time to time I'll notice someone who seems to have no spirits around them at all, who seems isolated from the divine loving support that constantly surrounds most of us. I used to worry that I was developing blind spots where some people were concerned, and if that were true I needed to do something about it. Now I know that there's a perfectly good reason why some people don't have a team from the other side around them. It's impossible to accumulate a team from a place you've never been. Those solitary people are dark entities who, by their own choice, take the left door instead, and pay a horrible spiritual price for it too. I've also found great spiritual comfort in the truth of the journey of the dark side. On one hand, I know that the perfect God I believe in could never really be vindictive enough to banish any of his children from his sacred presence for eternity. On the other hand, I couldn't make peace with the idea that Ted Bundy and I, who are what I'll politely call polar opposites on the subject of the sanctity of humanity, could end up in the very same embrace of the other side between lifetimes, as if there is no significant difference between my soul and the soul of a serial killer. Now I know what sends Ted Bundy and other card-carrying members of the dark side through the left door for countless dark incarnations while most of us make it safely home to the other side. The dark side defiantly turns their backs on a God who never did and never will stop loving them, which is the one thing most of us find as spiritually inconceivable as the dark side itself. And to prove that our Creator really does love each of His children eternally and unconditionally, not even dark entities are doomed to horseshoe from the left door into the womb again forever. The spirits and angels on the other side are well aware of these lost spirits, and sooner or later they literally catch them in their quick transit from one dimension to another and bring them home to be embraced by God and infused with love again by the white light of the Holy Spirit, the only force powerful enough to reunite them with the sanctity of their souls. The dark side at the end of days. The continuous cycle dark entities experience when each incarnation ends from Earth through the left door and right back in utero again is obviously going to hit a serious snag when life on Earth is no longer possible. How can they horseshoe into an earthly womb when there are no longer any earthly wombs to be found? What will happen to the Earth's dark side after the end of days? There is in this universe an infinite, unfathomable force field, a great uncreated mass we can't begin to comprehend, a core from which the love and power of God emanate. This uncreated mass is where the rarest, most highly advanced souls from every inhabited planet willingly end their journeys, forfeiting their identities to be literally absorbed into the essence of God's force field. Once a spirit has given itself to that ultimate power, it never regains its previous identity. It doesn't cease to exist, it simply becomes indistinguishable and inseparable from the mass of which it's become a part. For example, picture pouring a cup of water into the Pacific Ocean. That cup of water hasn't ceased to exist, but it can't and won't ever again be separated from the huge body that's consumed it. So there are those rare, supreme spirits who offer their very identities to God's infinite uncreated mass. And it's into that same ultimate sanctity that dark entities will be absorbed at the end of days, in a final, loving, holy embrace of purification by the one who created them and who never let their rejection of Him dissuade Him from adoring them. Earthbounds at the end of days. Earthbounds, or ghosts, as many of you know, are spirits who, for a variety of reasons, either see the tunnel that will take them to the other side when they die and reject it, or they refuse to acknowledge it at all. This leaves them stranded, outside of their bodies, caught between the lower vibrational level we exist in on Earth and the much higher frequency vibrational level of home. Ghosts are clueless that, in earthly terms, they've died. They're very much alive as far as they're concerned, exactly where they were an hour, a day, or a week ago. Nothing has changed from their perspective except for the sudden, inexplicable fact that no one seems to be able to see or hear them because they've changed frequencies without knowing it. People who've experienced hauntings complain about how ornery and irritable ghosts seem to be. Try having everyone around you suddenly start treating you as if you don't exist and see if you don't find it irritating. While the details vary dramatically from one ghost to the next, the two most common reasons why they inadvertently or deliberately miss the opportunity to go home boil down to passion, which can be either love or hate, and fear. Some stay behind to care for a child they adore, or to wait for a lover to come home, or to protect their cherished home from intruders. Others stay behind to seek revenge on real or imagined enemies, which never works, by the way, so don't spend 1 minute worrying about that. Still others are so afraid God will find them undeserving of His loving welcome home that they remain earthbound rather than face Him. Fortunately, mostly for them but for us as well, let's face it, there is no such thing as a ghost who's eternally trapped here on earth. Thanks to an enormous and constantly growing human awareness that will be virtually universal by the last decades of this century, a lot of ghosts are directed to the tunnel and the other side by people who recognize them and understand that there's really great compassion in saying, "You're dead. Go home." But the spirits on the other side are far more aware of earthbound souls than we are, and they perform their own constant interventions for as long as it takes until each ghost has celebrated the joyful reunion that's waiting for them on the other end of that tunnel. I will never forget the indescribable experience of visiting Ground Zero not long after the despicable terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center on September 11, 2001. Among the countless feelings that flooded through me were the surprise, relief, and gratitude that not a single one of the 3,000 casualties of that awful tragedy failed to make it quickly and safely home. Not a single ghost was left behind, confused and lost and frightened, thanks to God's exquisite, perfect, loving grace. And exactly the same thing will happen at the end of days. Through the grace of God, none of His children will be left behind or cast aside, including the earthbounds who will suddenly see the tunnel, joyfully embrace it, and join the rest of us in continuing our perfect, blissful lives on the other side. The cosmic other side. As long as Earth exists, our other side will exist as well. It's where all our earthly spirits come from when we enter the womb, and it's where we return when we die. It's a very real place, more beautiful than our finite minds can imagine, but our spirit minds remember it and are homesick for it from the moment we leave until the moment we get back. It's not far, far away. It's not over the rainbow, or beyond the moon and the stars. As I mentioned earlier, it's right here among us, another dimension superimposed on ours, just 3 feet above our version of ground level. Its topography is a perfect mirror image of Earth, with one exception, because there's no erosion or pollution on the other side. Its landscape is an image of the Earth from thousands of years ago, when bodies of water were pure blue and mountains and coastlines were perfectly intact. On the other side, Atlantis and Lemuria, our lost continents, thrive. So do the world's great architectural, literary, and artistic masterpieces, even if they're crumbling or have long since been destroyed in our harsh world. The same is true for every other inhabited planet. Their other sides are 3 feet above their ground levels, at a much higher vibrational frequency than that of the planet they surround. Their topographies are identical to their home planets, and their great works and structures are impeccably preserved. Remember, the end of days on Earth will mean that this planet will be unable to sustain life, but the planet itself will remain intact. As long as Earth itself exists, our other side will exist. The same is true for every other inhabited planet and their respective other sides. And as inhabited planets become more spiritually advanced and less separate from one another, which we have to look forward to in the coming decades, their other sides will begin blending with the great, infinite, universal other side, especially when their environments will no longer support human life. If the Earth were destroyed tomorrow, we and our other side would join the spirits whose planets have already completed their natural cycles, who are living the same joyful, sacred lives that wait for us among the stars, where our home beyond home called the cosmic other side eternally thrives. To picture its location in the most beautiful possible way, think of the ancient imagery of the great man in the night sky. The great man's head is the constellation Aries. His feet are the constellation Pisces. The rest of his body is outlined by the other 10 constellations of the zodiac. That is the closest we can come to imagining where we can look to find some hint of the cosmic other side. The cosmic other side is as identical a reflection of the universe as our other side is of Earth, and it's populated by incarnated spirits and messiahs from formerly inhabited planets that no longer exist. All, of course, simply part of God's promise that we are eternally safe and loved, and the lives He gave us are guaranteed to never end. Leaving Earth, going home, I once appeared on Larry King Live with the late Matty Stepanek, the theologian, philosopher, poet, and mystical traveler who passed away at the age of 13. Matty, as most of you know, suffered for much of his life from a tragic inherited disease called dysautonomic mitochondrial myopathy, and he was in a wheelchair when we met, speaking with the help of a respirator, the most cheerful, positive, self-assured, God-centered child you can imagine. Larry King asked, "Matty, are you afraid of death?" And Matty replied, "I'm afraid of dying, but I'm not afraid of death." I think there's great universal truth in that statement, I'm just not sure I've ever heard it put more simply and clearly. As we anticipate the end of days, or just the end of our lives on earth whenever and however they occur, isn't it really the process of death that frightens us, as opposed to death itself? Ask anyone who's had a near-death experience and they'll all tell you the same thing, they no longer have any fear of death whatsoever. That was true for Matty Stepanek, and it's true for me. I had a near-death experience when I underwent routine surgery at the age of 42. In fact, it's fair to say I had an actual death experience, since the monitor keeping track of my vital signs flatlined for a few minutes. And I have the advantage of remembering every moment of it, so I can give you a first-hand account of exactly what happens when we die. The legendary tunnel immediately appeared. It didn't come from up there somewhere. Instead, it rose up from my body, seemingly from my own etheric substance. It didn't lead up toward the sky, it led across, at maybe a 20-degree angle, confirming what my spirit guide Francine had told me a million times: the other side really is a paradise that's right here among us, only 3 feet above our ground level. I had never felt, or been, so completely, thrillingly, vibrantly alive as I was when I moved through the tunnel. I felt free and weightless, relieved to be rid of my body and free from the pull of gravity. I was immediately infused with peace, bliss, and total recall of home and the truth of eternity. With that recall came a release of all worry about the loved ones I'd left behind. I knew they would be fine as they proceeded living out their charts, and I also knew that in what would seem like the blink of an eye to me, we'd be together again on the other side, so there was no sadness, no sense of loss, and no missing them. The sacred, brilliant white light appeared ahead of me. Everything I'd heard and read about it was true somehow, it seemed almost alive, pulsating with God's love and His infinite knowledge, and an awareness flooded through me that the light was as familiar to me as my own soul. The figure of a loved one appeared in the large opening at the end of the tunnel. In my case it was my cherished Grandma Ada, whom I'd yearned to see again since I was 18. Beyond her I could see a grassy, flower-filled meadow, like the most beautiful meadow on earth, with its colors enriched and magnified 1,000 times. That trip home for me was obviously interrupted, by Grandma Ada gesturing for me to stop and by a distant voice of a friend by my hospital bed pleading, "Sylvia, Don't go, you're so needed. I was deeply depressed for days about finding myself back on Earth, and while I eventually became grateful to have stayed, I can promise you from the core of my soul that death was and is absolutely nothing to fear. It is exactly the return to the all-encompassing love of God's arms that we've all hoped it will be and that our spirits remember perfectly and look forward to. Before I describe the utter joy of our actual arrival on the other side, I want to clarify my strong beliefs about a couple of the most breathlessly anticipated events of the end of days, urging you as always to study, think, and come to your own conclusions. The Second Coming and the Rapture. According to Christian literature and legend, two major events involving Jesus Christ will be among the most telling signs that the end of days are at hand: his reappearance on earth in human form, and his appearance among the clouds to take the faithful to heaven in a phenomenon called the rapture. They're both beautiful thoughts, but I don't happen to believe that either of them will happen when the end of days arrives. I take Jesus at his sacred word when he said, in Matthew 28:20, "And lo, I am with you always, to the very end of time." He didn't say, "I will be with you," which implies some future event, but of far more importance, it also implies that there might be some period of time when he's absent from us. That's simply not true. He's been with us every second since his divine resurrection, he's with us at this moment, he'll be with us when we return to our lives on the other side, and he'll be with us throughout our joyful eternity at home. We can stop waiting for him and watching for him. He's already here, an essential part of our present tense. Didn't he accomplish everything we could ever want or need or hope for during his one divine incarnation? For what reason would he come again? To prove that he's real, and that he truly is the Son of God? Don't we already know that beyond all doubt? And sadly, isn't it likely that his second coming would create the same controversy and skepticism he faced 2,000 years ago? Besides, what more effective way to put every phony reincarnated Messiah out of business? And believe me, more and more of them will be cropping up as this century progresses than to say, and mean, "I've stopped looking for Jesus out there, because I have the peace of knowing he's already right here." Then point to your heart and remember, "And lo, I am with you always, to the very end of time." I also believe that the anticipation of the rapture, Christ embracing the faithful in the sky at the end of days, is actually the anticipation of imagery that was never meant to be taken literally. And I believe that the real rapture preceding the end of days will be far more thrilling and far more sacred. Remember, part of the rapture of the book of Revelation is God's judgment of all of humankind by what was written in the book of life, by what they had done. Revelation 20:12, "And if anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire." Revelation 20:15, "I said in an earlier chapter and I'll say again, the God I know, the God I worship who created us all, is perfect in his kindness, his forgiveness, his wide open arms, and his absolute, unconditional love." I cannot and will not conceive of a God so cruel, spiteful, and merciless that he would condemn any of his children to an eternity in a lake of fire. Even the dark entities who've turned away from God, while he continues to love them and wait for their return to him, will become a part of him when life on earth ends. So unless Jesus would appear in the clouds to deliver all of us, without judgment or discrimination, I can't imagine the Revelation version of the rapture. And as you'll read later in this chapter, no one judges our lives on earth but us, after we've arrived on the other side. There's also a simple matter of logistics, by the way. While Jesus can obviously appear anywhere and everywhere he wants, I repeat from personal experience, my spirit guide Francine, and more study and research than I can possibly describe, that the other side is 3 feet above the ground level of Earth. So why our spirits would be drawn all the way up into the sky for our trip to a home just 3 feet above us, I can't imagine. I promise, the true rapture is going to be far more spiritually enormous, and far more godly in its universal, unconditional love. A beautiful story, not a biblical one, that illustrates that unconditional love so eloquently. The end of days had arrived, and the righteous who were gathered in anticipation of the rapture finally asked God about Jesus's whereabouts. Jesus is outside the gate, God replied, waiting for Judas. The true rapture will be the increasing groundswell of deep spirituality that will be pervasive throughout the world by the end of days. It will supersede individual religions, politics, racial differences, anything and everything that stands in the way of humankind finally understanding that because we all share the same Father and the same home, what separates us pales in comparison to what unites us. The true rapture will be the subtle lifting of the veil between our dimension and the dimension of the other side, so that we on earth will have easy access to the spirit world that waits to celebrate our return. The true rapture will be a diminishing fear of the end of days, as our memories of our previous lives and deaths become clearer to us and we know beyond all doubt that we are eternal, that death is nothing but an illusion, and that a simple step through the veil between dimensions will bring us the peace and joy and is our birthright as God's children. The true rapture will be the understanding that God is not vengeful and cruel, so that at the end of days all of us will be safe and loved in His arms forever. The Antichrist, we might as well get the subject of the Antichrist out of the way while we're at it, since being braced for his arrival seems to be as essential to the end of days anticipation as the second coming and the rapture. It will be a brief discussion, because we can officially stop watching for the Antichrist. The Antichrist is already here, in human form. The Antichrist has a name. The name is apathy. It's a fact that evil prevails when good men do nothing. Too many have been doing nothing for far too long, and what could be more anti-Christ than to take the position that poverty, hunger, injustice, and abuse of the planet and its inhabitants are none of our business, or that we're just too busy to do anything about it. Apathy is a luxury we can't afford any longer, nor do we want to, because in the end it will destroy us. As spirituality on earth takes firm root in this century and begins to thrive as each of us finds our God center and, by definition, we become more Christ-like, the Antichrist of apathy will be driven away. A day will come when we can't imagine not taking care of each other and this world that's been entrusted to us. And it's completely up to us how far in the future that day is, and how long we're going to tolerate the Antichrist in our midst by doing nothing. Arriving on the other side, we hear so often about the tunnel and the brilliant white light at its end we have to look forward to when we die that it almost creates the impression that our journey home stops there. But of course the journey only begins there. And I think it's unkind at the very least that so few discussions of the end of days address the question, and then what? The answer is, and then we pick up our real lives again, right where they left off. Just as all roads lead to Rome, according to the old saying, all tunnels lead to the entrance to the other side. No matter where on this earth we leave our bodies, we all take exactly the same trip to exactly the same place. We emerge from the tunnel to find ourselves in a breathtakingly beautiful meadow. Waiting there to greet us are deceased loved ones from the life we've just left behind, as well as friends and loved ones from all our past lives, on Earth and on the other side. Our spirit guides are there. Our true soul mates are there. And best of all, as far as I'm concerned, every animal we've ever loved from every lifetime we've lived is on hand, with such pure, urgent joy that the people waiting to welcome us have a hard time making their way through the happy crowd. Beyond the meadow, and our glorious welcome home party, is a gleaming cluster of massive, gorgeous structures that are essential to our transition from Earth to the other side, the Hall of Records, with its towering marble columns and glittering dome, which contains, among other things, every chart of every incarnation of every one of our lives on Earth, the Hall of Justice, pillared, domed white marble, most revered for its impossibly beautiful gardens and its treasured statue of Asna, the mother god, the towers, twin monoliths of white marble and blue glass, where extra care is provided for arrivals from Earth who need special psychological and emotional help with their return home, and the Hall of Wisdom, with its vast marble steps and massive entry doors, to which most of us directly proceed from our thrilling wealth of reunions. I promised earlier that I would describe the only judgment we'll face at the end of days. It's the same judgment we face every time we finish an incarnation and return home, and it's undoubtedly the harshest judgment we could ever imagine. It takes place in a gigantic room in the Hall of Wisdom. Our spirit guide accompanies us to one of the countless white marble benches that surround the room. We take a seat by ourselves, with our spirit guides looking on, and begin a process that many near-death survivors recall but few remember in enough detail to understand exactly what happened. You've heard those who have had a close brush with death describe feeling as if their whole life flashed before their eyes. The truth is, they didn't just imagine it. What they actually experienced was an abbreviated trip to the quiet stillness of that room in the Hall of Wisdom where the scanning machine sits waiting. The scanning machine is a huge convex dome of blue glass. And through that glass dome, we watch each and every moment of the life we've just lived unfold before our eyes. Rather than appearing like a movie, our life plays out in the form of a three-dimensional hologram, so that no matter where we move around the scanning machine, we can see every detail, good or bad, right or wrong, with perfect clarity. We review our lives for as long as it takes, even rewinding as much footage as we want as often as we want. Obviously, our encounter with the scanning machine is more than just an entertaining way for us to make the transition from Earth to the other side. It's an essential step in the eternal journey of our spirits. As we trudge along through our lives on Earth, we have no significant memories of the charts we wrote for those lives to help us accomplish the specific goals we came here for. But the moment we return home and arrive at the scanning machine, we have total recall of our charts. So it's not just a matter of watching our last incarnation unfold in three-dimensional detail for the sheer nostalgia of it, it's a matter of seeing how that incarnation stacked up against the detailed plans we laid out for it ahead of time. And make no mistake about it, it's the toughest judge of all who ultimately evaluates our success and failure, not our spirit guide, not God, but us. Us as our spirit selves, mind you, from the perspective of the other side, where not only is there no negativity but there's also no defensiveness and no ego-driven self-justification to prevent us from facing the truth of our actions and being accountable for them. During our lives on the other side, the scanning machine is one of our most valuable research tools. In the same way we study our just completed incarnation when we first return home, we can also study every other incarnation we've spent on Earth, and, for that matter, every incarnation of anyone and everyone who interests us, by essentially playing any chart we choose through the hologram projector of the scanning machine. We can be an eyewitness to any event in our spirit's history or the history of humankind, or if we prefer we can even merge with that event, becoming a part of it, feeling all the emotions its actual participants felt, without altering its dynamics or its outcome in any way. The scanning machine is one of our most cherished destinations when we return home and as we proceed with our busy lives there. But its value will only intensify when the end of days comes and our time on earth is through. It will allow us to revisit as often as we like the lives we lived and the lessons we learned on that planet we'll never see again. And, more than that, it will provide our souls with the immeasurable growth that learning from our earthly mistakes can offer as the reincarnation phase of our eternal lives draws to a close. Life on the Other Side. By no coincidence, I've written an entire book called Life on the Other Side, which I hope you'll refer to every time you find yourself becoming even slightly anxious about the end of days. If you come away with nothing else from that book or this one, I hope you'll remember and believe this one simple truth: our lives on earth are nothing but sleepwalking compared to the blissful, divine exhilaration of being alive in that sacred place that's our real home. Never doubt that the other side is every bit as real as Earth. In fact, my spirit guide Francine insists it's far more real, and that we are actually the ghosts in their world rather than the other way around. The landscape is exquisite again, identical to Earth as it was before erosion, pollution, natural disasters, and human destruction took their toll. Atlantis and Lemuria thrive in clear blue oceans. The Parthenon, the Great Library of Alexandria, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, the Venus de Milo, all earthly wonders and treasures look brand new. Coastlines and mountaintops are as sharply defined as the day they were created. And everything thrives in weather that is a perpetually calm, pure 78 degrees. There is no day or night, no time at all on the other side. All that exists is now. In our spirit identities, which are the finest of all our personality traits on earth, we never need to eat or sleep. We have careers that reflect our greatest passions and talents, and our social lives are as busy as we choose, with the widest possible variety of friends since everyone at home knows and loves each other. We create our homes through thought projection, just as travel involves nothing more than thinking ourselves wherever we'd like to be. While God's presence fills the very air we breathe, there are magnificent houses of worship everywhere, with all religions shared and celebrated. The angels walk among us, never speaking to us or to each other, making no sounds at all until they join in a massive choir to perform indescribably thrilling concerts of hymns in a revered structure called the Hall of Voices. There is no negativity, no sorrow, no illness, no pain, no imperfection of any kind on the other side. No matter what age we were when we left our earthly bodies behind, we're all 33 years old at home, at our perpetual peak of vitality. We are pure love and purely loving with every breath we take. Our eternal lives are a constant celebration of the joy of living in our Creator's holy presence. All of which leads to what may be the most significant point of all about that time when life on earth ceases to exist, with so much sacred, peaceful joy waiting for us on the other side. Maybe we should stop calling it the end of days and start calling it the beginning. The benediction from the Inca Cuero shamans: follow your own footsteps. Learn from the rivers, the trees, and the rocks. Honor the Christ, the Buddha, your brothers and sisters. Honor your Earth Mother and the Great Spirit. Honor yourself and all of creation. Look with the eyes of your soul and engage the essential. Amen. About the author. Sylvia Browne is the #1 New York Times best-selling author of many books, including Psychic Children, The Two Marys, The Mystical Life of Jesus, Insight, Phenomenon, and Prophecy. A working psychic for more than 50 years, she appears weekly on The Montel Williams Show, and regularly on Larry King Live. She lives in California. 1 Zilhajj, the last month of the Islamic calendar. 2 Idul-Adha, the festival of sacrifice. 3 The Kaaba, an oblong stone building in the center of the holy city of Mecca that houses the sacred black stone given to Abraham by the angel Gabriel.